Well, it's nothing new in the journalism world. A race to reel in readers. Magazine splashed shocking headlines on its covers to attract buyers. This week, New York Magazine published a piece about a so-called millionaire teenager trader that turned out to be a fraud. And Rolling Stone had to backtrack after its piece on a University of Virginia student whose account about being raped is now being disputed. Paul Levinson is a professor of communications and media studies at Fordham University and the author of New Media. And he is here to shed some light on what is going on. Paul, thank you for joining us here today. These are vastly different stories and of a vastly different serious nature. But first, how did both magazines get this terribly wrong?
Well, New York Magazine just messed up because basically the story is a rather stupid story in any case. They were scammed, and that's just totally inexcusable.
But then the New York Post, not the bastion of journalism, followed along.
Right.
And doesn't that happen way too often in this industry? I mean, we're to blame as well. Glass houses and everything. We just follow whoever leads a story.
Well, absolutely. And social media are part of it too. All too often, the quote research that traditional media do is looking at Twitter. And you have to do more than that. But to get to Rolling Stone, that's a completely different situation. They uncovered a very grievous situation, rapes going on college campuses, and they got some things a little wrong. But the story itself is an extremely important, extremely critical story for Americans to know about. So I think there's been far too much criticism of Rolling Stone and, frankly, not enough praise for their uncovering the story.
Yeah, they haven't retracted the whole idea of the story, just that they did not interview certain people along the way.
That's right.
The idea of either sensationalistic journalism or muckraking journalism, goes back to William Randolph Hearst and the idea of crusading journalism. I often say that the country was built on advocacy journalism. Is certainly nothing new. But what kind of pressure does the print media now face in the world of the constant, like you said, Twitter sphere?
A little more pressure than 100 years ago, but not that much, because apropos of Hearst, what was going on, say, in 1900, when all you had were newspapers, no television, not even radio, you had dozens of newspapers sometimes in big cities, and they were all competing to get out there with a story first, to get the headline out before anybody else, to scoop their competitors. So the pressure has always been on journalism, and that's why it developed these techniques of checking out their sources.
But in that era, you were competing on a level playing field in some ways. You're both using the same technology. When you turn to the magazine industry, does the magazine industry feel like they need to offer something a little bit more? And possibly that's in-depth journalism, but at the same point, it comes at a price.
Well, they want to stay current. No one wants to be yesterday's news. But again, in the case of Rolling Stone, they didn't rush the article. They did do a lot of work, and they did report an extremely important story. And in some ways, the most ridiculous aspect of that is the other media, like the New York Times. I saw Bill Keller on a television show attacking Rolling Stone. You talk about people living in glass houses.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. And by the way, Rolling Stone had to retract its retraction, correct? It kind of went a little bit further in basically damning this woman than the accuser.
It wasn't the most artful retraction. There's no doubt about it. But that's a small footnote to this vastly important story.
And generally speaking, when you look at the magazine industry now and you look at the newspaper industry, do you find that it's starting to carve out a space for it in the new media world? Because we look at what happened with New Republic and that debacle there. Or are we talking about a press that's ultimately, making, as they say, buggy whips for horses?
If we're talking about papers as paper you can hold in your hand, obviously that has shrunk and it's going to continue to shrink, but there is still an extremely important niche for good journalism. So, for example, I read the Rolling Stone story online, and you don't need to actually hold a physical paper in your hand anymore.
Okay. Paul Levinson, professor of communications and media studies at Fordham University and the author of New Media. Thank you for coming by. Hope to see you again.
My pleasure.
And